the value of an individual human life, from the context of being a fellow human being myself, is undoubtedly difficult to understate. As such, to allow such lives to play out in the most meaningful ways they can, the notion of human rights is integral not only to the way we see the world around us, but etched into the way we socially organize. That is to say, the vast majority of us can probably all find agreement that we ought to prescribe certain basic rights, and with them liberties, to all humans in some form. But where do rights come from? What constitutes a human right? Do they derive from one another? These questions on specifics are still very much subject to debate and discussion between different individual and cultural perspectives. The clash of epistemologies informing each, one could say. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in the UN General Assembly in 1948. No member state at the time voted against it, and the committee that drafted it included representatives from all over the world. Most rights prescribed in the Declaration are very agreeable. Article 25 even includes rights like the right to healthcare and food, which are still contested, for instance, in the United States, to be rights instead of privileges. But however progressive the Declaration may be in certain instances, both then and now, it's the wording of Article 17 that positions the Declaration firmly on one side of an extremely important, often neglected debate to which we must turn our attention. It's a debate where even many socialists and communists will and do disagree with me. Article 17 reads as follows. Everyone has the right to own property alone, as well as in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. To understand a little more about what this means, and in particular the implications of that first sentence, we have to take a look at a few key figures in the debate. And we'll start with this guy.
The one thing on this topic, Randy talked about taxation as theft. One thing always puzzled me about the Randian doctrine. Randian doctrine is different from other minarchist doctrines. Randians are against taxes. They say taxes are theft. Okay, that's excellent. However, they somehow don't conclude from that. It seems to me if you agree that taxation is theft, one concludes right away that not any organization which lives off theft is a criminal organization. Right? I mean, it seems to me it follows obviously.
This is Murray Rothbard, or was. He's dead now. But when he was alive, Murray was a pretty famous economist from the Austrian school, which, without getting into it too much, essentially did economics not through observation or the scientific method, but through certain axioms from the economic philosophy of primarily this guy, Ludwig von Mises. Both Ludwig and Murray were big fans of capitalism, which we'll define for now as private ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. So they were virulent supporters of private property. However, Rothbard took Austrian economics a bit further than his predecessors by essentially spurning all government entirely as unnecessary. Sure, most Austro-libertarians wanted to completely privatize the entire economy and destroy the public sector, but Murray was one of the first to argue sincerely that a government wasn't even necessary for the protection of property rights, instead claiming that such rights were natural, objective, and inevitable. Anarcho-capitalism, the movement to which Rothbard is possibly the central figure, has based itself off this premise and continues to do so where it exists today. The natural rights argument proclaims that not only are rights good and useful for humanity, but that they're also universal truths as well. The right to life is deemed objective because those who do not respect it tend to end up no longer living, and those who survive therefore do so on the basis of this right existing. And according to Rothbard and many others like him, the right to property was just an extension of the right to life, because one's property supposedly becomes an important extension of that life and integral to one's independent survival. It It was for this reason that Murray Rothbard's views on ethics came to revolve around property rights as the central truth, the focal point that all ethical reasoning and all rights must reference. Crimes like rape or bodily assault were, to Rothbard, abhorrent because he considered them a violation of property rights, one's body being one's property. Rothbardian ethics gives you the right to kill someone, parasitically living off your property if you so choose, because they broke the non-aggression principle first. All in the name of a natural extension to the right to life. If this sounds contradictory and perhaps a bit troubling, here's something Rothbard said word for word about the ethics of child rearing. Because to Rothbard, rights all revolved around who is the owner of what, we could describe him as a proprietarian or proprietarian, a word not itself closely linked to Rothbard, but one that well describes his worldview. And while Rothbard was probably the most notable extreme example I could think of, plenty of philosophers took the proprietarian argument that property was natural and hence where rights can be derived, long before he was ever born. John Locke is the main philosopher associated with a more moderate proprietarianism, for example. The subject of property has been a staple debate between philosophers back since Plato and Aristotle, the former seeing value in collective ownership for the benefit of a united polity, the latter seeing privatization of property as a means of encouraging the virtues of charity and responsibility. However, it was the 17th and 18th centuries in which this debate was perhaps at its most notable. Locke's beliefs that any good government must use its powers with limitation to protect the core rights to life, liberty, and property through law have evidently retained much influence even today. The key figure on the other side of this debate, of course, was Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes and Locke's subject of disagreement was ultimately in their respective analyses of human nature, and its consequent implications on how one comes to denote property as a right, or even something favourable at all in the first place. Unlike Locke, Hobbes's view of humanity's natural state was far more pessimistic, one of unchecked violence and chaos between self-serving individuals who do not prescribe fellow human beings any natural rights. Consequently, Hobbes saw institutions, authority, and the social contract as necessary and preferable as a means of guaranteeing man-made, constructed rights. Hobbes's argument, therefore, was something we could perhaps term as an elective proprietarian position. Property, to Hobbes, was not justified for it being something natural or objective, as it was just a human ideal without any basis in the natural world. Rather, he saw it as justified through a more consequentialist reasoning. Coming up with property, he believed, had resulted in positive consequence for humanity as a whole, and should therefore be preserved at all costs. This position was also taken by later philosophers David Hume and Immanuel Kant, with their own nuances, of course, and is perhaps one of the most prevalent perspectives regarding justification for property rights today. Alongside the Aristotelian reasons of responsibility, virtue, and good care from taking personal ownership, many common arguments in support of this position can be traced to ideas such as incentive, with accumulation of property for the individual providing not only a reason for people to contribute to society in exchange, but also economic efficiency, as the competing interests of buyer and seller within the exchange of property creates markers in the form of price. These, according to elective proprietarians, give us a natural indication of how in demand a resource or commodity is, how much someone is willing to pay, against how easy it is to supply, how little one is willing to sell it for, allowing us to know how most effectively to allocate these resources and commodities, with people usually opting for the bargain. Furthermore, property is also seen as a way to ensure personal agency, as it provides the individual opportunity to express their individuality onto an object or service, and make free choices concerning it without being held to the jurisdiction or will of any larger collective. But there was also a third major philosopher who had come to insert himself into the debate, one that would take a decisively different line to either Locke or Hobbes. Let's meet our first critic of property on the list, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. To Rousseau, property was not only not within the natural state of humanity or any objective truth, but its development had in fact been a net negative for humanity in consequentialist terms. The arrival of property and law, thought JJR, had been responsible for establishing hierarchy, inequality, and stratification, all of which actually resulting in conflict and dominance over others, suppressing human freedom far more than enabling it. Establishing and maintaining property rights made obtaining and reserving property for oneself, instead of living together and sharing the means of survival, into something necessary and all-consuming to one's existence, and a monopoly on force enshrining property rights was, in its essence, just a means of violently forcing the population into the control of the violent, in order to be granted privilege of continued life. To Locke, property was natural. To Hobbes, it was a human creation that kept stability and freedom. To Rousseau, it was a human construct that sowed division and oppression. But hold on to your hats, everyone. This next one's the big deal. Enter Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Pierre has a three-word motto, one that turns the debate as we have currently seen it upon its head. Property is theft. That's right. It's time to talk about some anti-proprietarians and their thoughts on property rights, or seemingly anti-proprietarians at least. Proudhon's statement sounds pretty clear at first glance, but at the same time, an anti-proprietarian can't get too excited about it, because Proudhon still fundamentally believed in ownership and exchange. Even though he was opposed to capitalism and promoted collective ownership of industry by its workers, he still believed in trading its fruits in a market economy. Mutualism, as he called his philosophy, is essentially a sort of free market socialism, a bit like if under free market capitalism every business turned into a worker cooperative. So yes, Proudhon's rhetoric may have been brash, and his analysis as an anarchist of property rights relying on a state monopoly of force may be well placed, but clearly Proudhon still believed in some ownership in order for free rights and exchange to work. Proudhon was not opposed to people coming together to guarantee and ensure one another's rights, including, evidently, some ownership. So where's the line? It could be said that in leftist theory at this time, many roads lead to Karl Marx, and this is perhaps why Marx has had such success in finding a following even centuries after his death. Marx, too, was evidently a critic of property in Proudhon's sense, even claiming that communism, the eventual end point of historical progression, could be summed up simply as abolition of private property. Again, like with Proudhon, this initially looks good for the anti-proprietarian, yet there's still a catch. Marxism has come to classify property into three main categories, and the anarchism of people like Proudhon has essentially gone along with this same classification system: private, personal, and collective property. Private property is essentially synonymous with capital in this definition, property that is owned for accumulation of wealth, to make you a profit, or to justify the expropriation of labor. To Marx, it was this sort of property, such as in ownership of land or a business or a factory, in which the capitalist sought a legal means of taking value produced through the labor of a worker, taking some of that for themselves as passive income, returning to the worker a wage less than the value they added to the materials they used in their labor. This was also the type of property that Proudhon declared theft. Monopolizing control over an industry and using said control to leverage workers into exploitation to satisfy their needs was theft from all the rest of us. What gave that capitalist right to confiscate that control from the commons and keep it for themselves? Private property, instead of actually allowing people to keep the fruits of their labor, actually justified instead those fruits being taken away by some capitalist, according to Marx and Proudhon. Collective property, however, was Marx's preferred solution to this dilemma. Instead of industries and other private property being owned privately, Marx proclaimed that a socialist society would have this ownership and control redistributed to the workers in preparation for the communal property of communism, ownership by the community as a whole. Some Marxist strands of socialism saw state ownership as a way of centralizing and coordinating this workers' control, with representatives carrying out those workers' will, respectively. Personal property is used to refer to things that an individual may own for their own usage. A house, a car, a toothbrush. Marx saw no reason to collectivize or communalize these things, and neither did the anarchists. To Marx, you should be able to still own personal property in socialism. After all, the Marxist critique of capitalism is based on workers not coming to own the full value of the labor they produced, and this is what Marx wanted to fix. While under socialism, exchange may be done ideally in terms of labor points instead of a circulating currency, Marx expected that this would eventually become so well practiced in the higher stage of socialism, communism, that exchange of this sort could be done without the formalities. But nonetheless, this prospect is still based on ownership of personal property existing, coming from the labor one performs, and carrying an inherent set economic value. It's only when you start going to the left of Marx that a more comprehensive criticism of personal property, as well as private property, becomes easier to identify. For some, this is where one could place Kropotkin, who took the communal societal goal of Marx, along with the preference for no property over collective property of Proudhon, to found his own anarcho-communist school of thought. However, many practicing anarcho-communists do also accept the Marxist classifications of property and approach the debate on property in the same manner as the Marxists. Luckily, our next stop on this tour of the debate is to visit someone who took a different approach, one that provides a distinct alternative to the proprietarian consensus, even where it occasionally lingers in Marxist and anarchist theory.
Society. And I wondered, why couldn't we extend this whole phenomenon to the experience as a whole, the whole work experience? In other words, turn work into something that is much more playful, much more joyous, much more self-expressive. So consequently, again, I fell back on what I would call the anarchic utopian tradition.
This is Murray Bookchin. I know, another Murray, who also, at least for a time, called himself an anarchist, but this time on the exact opposite side of the debate. Murray B. was very much in the socialist camp, and his thought goes under many different labels. Most prevalently, he is seen as the principal theorist behind social ecology within the communalist political tradition, proposing political models such as libertarian municipalism. The last of these things actually caught the interest of this Kurdish guy who wants to put his own version of it to practice, although Murray is sadly no longer around to see it. The communalist philosophy in its modern sense actually directly posits an alternative to property, usufruct. This is not a word that was made up for ideological purposes, it's actually an arrangement that currently exists in law, in which the person with the usufruct may perform two of the three property interests onto the object or service that that usufruct is for. To demonstrate this, we can look at these three property interests that property rights bestow, and how usufruct as it exists within proprietarian society differs from property. Usufruct legally gives the subject right of usus, the right to use the object, and fructus, the right to profit off the fruits of that usage, but leaves out abusus, the right to destroy or exchange that object at their will. Now, within our current society, usufruct is usually given by property owners to other people, with the user gaining right of use but not inherent ownership, which remains with the proprietor. But in communalism without property, Bookchin envisions the concept of usufruct to become the norm instead of property, in describing the relationships between objects and people. Both the collective property of Marx and the mutual aid of Kropotkin are criticized by Bookchin as intrinsically proprietarian, as they still trace the mandate for an individual to appropriate and use a certain thing to an inherent proprietary nature of that object. This idea of an inherent relationship of ownership within the metaphysical capacity of an object, Murray saw no reason to sustain. It does not need to exist, and insisting on the redeemability of some property only serves to pave the way for restriction of other people's freedom to use,
and provides justification in itself to the notion of other forms of property. The right to forcibly infringe on the right to use, which to Bookchin was the right integral to life, property merely being one flawed way of trying to ensure it, were themselves a creation of property rights, be they private or personal. Murray's view of usufruct was posited as providing a replacement framework for the justification of the right to appropriate something. Instead of who is the inherent owner of an object being the focal point on the question of who can use what, such questions would more so become about respecting the right of the current user to usufruct of all non-property, with, when they finished using the thing, relinquishing any inherent right to appropriate it. In other words, property is no longer property, but its allocation to a certain person would be guaranteed conditionally based on other rights, the right to use or usufruct itself, of course, but also things like the right not to be assaulted, which would need to be broken in order to forcibly divorce a person from what they are using, something that only property rights happen to legitimize on an irrational, undemocratic basis. Given democratic decision by all those concerned was still very much supported by Bookchin, even to justify abuses or extraordinary circumstances, the reality is that in practice, Bookchin's communalism and communism aren't too dissimilar. You keep rights to what you use, and you lose rights to things you don't use. The difference is largely philosophical, as to whether you actually own the stuff you are able to keep rights to use or not. But it's an important difference to Murray Bookchin, even just in emphasizing user rights as more fundamental than owner rights to the right to life. It's fundamental to the way we perceive not only our rights, but our relationship with the surrounding world as well. And the way we perceive this relationship will undoubtedly become internalized in the culture we create, making it of additional significance. So, on a scale of one anarchist Murray to the other, where should I stand? Where should you? The task for the usufructarian in proposing an alternative to the current proprietarian consensus is to demonstrate how usufruct can guarantee everything one relies on property for and more. An important thing to know in order to approach such a debate in an appropriate context would be the historical impetus for property and the conditions which proprietary arrangements were designed to best navigate. In many societies, particularly on the Proto-American continent, the concept of property was not introduced as an organic response to material conditions, but through conquest by those whose societies had given rise to property. This is, of course, important to understand. Not all impressive historical civilizations were built upon modern Western-style concepts of property. Historical development can be approached in a multitude of different ways and in different directions, reflecting the specific shared understandings of a tradition, with relative codes of behavior and morality, respectively. What we can look at is a shared foundation for all of these traditions in the form of what Marx called primitive communism. Make no mistake, this society was hardly a model that we should seek to replicate. However, understanding it can help us to demonstrate that more egalitarian and collective alternatives to proprietarian institutions are hardly incompatible with any human nature. They have existed far longer than property itself. And we can evaluate from analyzing the society the characteristics of society that such institutions were adopted to respond to, notably Bookchin's concept of complementarity. The change in conditions begetting proprietarian institutions can, in short, be identified with the recognition of a sort of scarcity ceiling in tandem with the territorialization of production, in which simply moving into undepleted territory no longer became as viable. Consequently, institutions that allow personal reservation of land and resources, which are now subject to a scarcity that even collective action couldn't fundamentally overcome at the time, was adopted within Eurocentric traditions as a means of survival insurance. With this variability in resource opportunity came new power relations and grand involuntary hierarchies that ultimately would become all-consuming in their pertinence to lifestyle. Accumulation, individualist self-interest, and exploitation, to maintain one's place on this hierarchy, became self-defensive measures, and proprietarian society evolves consequently. Our task now, be it within the context of a greater cultural movement or within political institutions, is to evaluate whether the needs for something like property that were responsible for its creation still apply. In a world defined by overproduction, the spectre of automation, and a multitude of crises for which we need complementarity back, I would posit that property, all property, has exhausted its function to our society and now exists as a net negative. The vast majority of peoples in today's society are now unequivocally more limited by reservation of things outside of one's immediate possession than empowered by it. Unlike when property first manifested, our capacity to use, hence to survive, to express ourselves freely, to follow our dreams free from dictation, to have choice and security and so forth, would be increased were we to make the switch from property to usufruct. The much-needed re-emergence of collective interest as a priority of self-interest would only serve to expand personal responsibility and would be the natural consequence of removing the market's artificial incentives in favor of the natural survival impetus that has sustained our species long prior to property's existence. As for the question of economic efficiency, the use of new technological frameworks like liquid e-democracy would allow us to expand the dynamic nature of our horizontally planned economy to a much greater reach than ever before, to be updated instantaneously with far more precise information as to the nature of demand and the supply available than any speculation-driven market or price signal could ever provide as a middleman. All of the advantages and needs we see in the institution of property, therefore, seem only to be one-upped by usufruct within a society of our current technological capacity. That said, this video is merely an introduction to the debate, and I would strongly encourage those from all sides to partake further within it. While making this video, I was asked a couple of times why I would insist on posing myself as a critic of property as opposed to merely a critic of capitalism. Yet I feel that, if anything, this lexical choice is a crucial one. The appropriation of anti-capitalism by the culture industry into but a term of vague academic critique deliberately obfuscates the central and easily understandable principle which lies behind accumulation, inequality of economic power, fragmentation, stratification, and so much else. I am not just anti-capitalist, anti-capital, or anti-private property. I am anti-property. It is the very notion of proprietorship, in particular individualized proprietorship, that has produced the grand hierarchies which we have socially internalized, that has fragmented humanity and steers us towards corporate oligarchy and ecological destruction. This issue goes beyond capitalism, feudalism, the so-called lower stage of socialism, or any other application of property. It is the same issues that persist. Meanwhile, government in its present state, both on national and international levels, simultaneously serves as a prop for the interests of property and a propaganda outlet of its ideological narrative, all while playing a vital role in propping up the institution in the first place. This is why the UDHR position should matter to any critic of society's most dangerous feedback loops. Article 17 is the proprietarian clause, and as an anti-proprietarian, this is simply a human right that I do not agree is in our best collective interests to maintain. To me, it's an unwritten usufructarian clause from which I believe human rights ought to be derived to maximize the meaningful contributions that humans of all different groups and epistemologies can give to our lives.
Hello everybody, as you can probably tell from my voice, I'm the person who just made the video that you just watched, the proprietarian clause. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it both informative and fun as well. That's my hope. I made this all by myself, it was just me, so I don't really expect much to come of it, but I have a question to ask you, which is, would you like to see any more sort of stuff like this? I could probably do something or other. Please do let me know. I'll leave ways for you to contact me. So yeah, if you want to weigh in, there should be a link that I will edit in. And yeah, I'm interested to hearing your perspectives and meeting you, some of you, hopefully. Alright, see you there.